The following program is an original production of WICC PBS Chicago.
This week on In the Loop, homeless and hurting. In Chicago, 1 in 5 people living in shelters and on the streets suffer from mental illness. What's being done to help this struggling population?
I didn't see no light. All I seen was my child face. And that's all I could see is my child shadow and a reflection of myself.
Inauguration no-shows. Why several Illinois lawmakers have chosen to skip Donald Trump's big day.
The reason I'm not going is that I can't bring myself to justify morally or intellectually the immense power we are placing in that man's hands.
Plus, therapy on ice. How some military veterans deal with life after combat.
Everybody's got their little demons from their deployments, and it's okay here because that's who we are.
Stay with us for these stories and much more tonight on In the Loop. Good evening. I'm Chris Bury. As winter sets in, nearly 6,000 people in Chicago are homeless, staying in shelters or choosing to get by on the streets. It is a brutal life, made even more difficult for the 1 in 5 who are suffering from mental illness. While the city is making strides to find housing and employment for the most vulnerable, resources remain scarce. Access to medication and treatment are elusive. The state budget crisis and the city's financial struggles make it harder to help. In late December, the Northside Housing Shelter in the Uptown neighborhood was hoping for a miracle. The shelter provided food, showers, and 72 beds for its adult male residents. Despite pleas from the community, it was unable to raise the $100,000 in funding it needed. The residents were scheduled to be evicted just before Christmas. Homeless shelters are often the only option for those on the streets. The city reports nearly 80% of Chicago's homeless stay in shelters. The rest brave it on their own. Erica Young is one of those who found herself alone in Chicago with her 3-year-old son JECMEN and nowhere to go.
I was in a domestic violence situation with my ex-husband, and it wasn't safe for me or my child, so I chose to leave Florida to come back to Chicago. The biggest challenge was your child looking up to you, asking you where you're going, where you're going to eat, where we're going to sleep, where we're going to go, not having the answers for them, being out in the cold, just walking Chicago feeling like you just have nobody but yourself.
Young says she's been diagnosed with depression, PTSD, and bipolar disorder. She and her son bounced around from shelter to shelter. The constant moving made it difficult for Young to get back on her medications.
The waiting list was just 2 or 3 months long just to get evaluated, and another 2 or 3 months just to get back on my medication. So I had to pretty much go cold turkey without it. I had a lot of crying spells, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, didn't want to be a bother with nobody, didn't wanted to be alone, just wanted to just disappear, feel like a butterfly and just fly away.
While some shelters could provide adequate support, others were unsafe, even dangerous, particularly with Young caring for a small child.
People stealing, not having nowhere to put your stuff at. You're trying to sleep with your stuff on you and keep your child next to you so nobody touch your child. Different people coming in and out of the shelters, you're not knowing their backgrounds and where they come from, and the cleanlessness, people not cleaning up behind themselves.
The shelters were the only option for Erica Young and her daughter, but others, including KAYLA Jackson, feel they must take a different route.
I was kind of battling with the fact of me being transgender. I have always been really scared of what people would think of me, and a homeless shelter was not a place I would want to be.
Jackson was kicked out of her home in her early 20s and began hormone therapy to transition to becoming a woman. She was diagnosed with depression. Her street life, combined with prostitution, led to substance abuse.
I had medication, but I didn't take it. I didn't take it because I was too busy drinking and smoking marijuana to just take away everything.
Their stories are not unique. Experts say the high concentration of mentally ill on the streets can be traced back to a shift in treatment away from mental hospitals. NICOLE Richardson is Vice President of General Operations with Thresholds, an organization that works with the homeless and mentally ill.
People were put in mental hospitals for very, very long times, 20 years sometimes, even longer. In the 70s, deinstitutionalization came along, and so they emptied out mental hospitals without having service provision for those folks. So what we saw at that time was a huge jump in the number of homeless people on the streets.
Chicago saw another sharp jump in mentally ill homeless in 2012, when Mayor Emanuel closed 6 of the city's 12 mental health clinics. Many of the people treated at Thresholds have spent years on the streets and need to relearn such basics as relating to other people.
One of the things that we work on with folks is just socialization. How do you communicate? How do you have an interactive conversation? Those are things that you and I take for granted, but people lose. People who are homeless, they learn how to survive on the streets. They learn how to be homeless. When they're moving back into society, they have to unlearn some of those things and relearn how to exist in society.
Richardson applauds Chicago's efforts to improve individual conditions for the homeless, but says larger systemic challenges must be addressed.
I feel on a fundamental level that the city of Chicago is very invested in addressing the issue of homelessness, especially for folks with mental illness. However, our mental health system in the state of Illinois is so fragmented that it's impossible to have all of the key players at the table who need to be to really create a recovery-oriented system of care. There's just not enough funding. There's not enough funding, there's not enough housing. We will never be able to impact homelessness in Chicago, in Illinois, in the United States until we address housing.
Mayor Emanuel appears to agree. In 2012, he announced a plan that focuses on homeless prevention, housing, and other services. Since its inception, the city has sheltered thousands of people and expanded shelter space for children and young adults. And those supportive services have made a difference in the lives of many who have suffered mental illness without having a place to live.
It feels good to just sleep at night and knowing that we're safe, we're warm, we're not in the cold. It's a very good feeling. It makes motherhood much better too.
Y'all go through stuff, no one is perfect. And if you feel like you can get through it, you can, because look at me, look where I'm at, you know. I have everything that I ever wanted.
The day before the Northside Housing Shelter was scheduled to close, its residents got a reprieve. The shelter would remain open. It was rescued by financial support from the Riva and David Logan Foundation and the Chicago Department of Family and Social Services. But Northside cannot expect much help from Springfield. The stopgap budget only provided half of the $16 million the state requires for services, which specifically includes housing for people with mental illness. Now joining us to talk about this week's trending topics are Rod Joy, Executive Director for Change, the Coalition for Honest and New Government Ethics, Jane McCahill, attorney with Ackerman Law Offices, and DELMARIE COBB, consultant with the Publicity Works, and welcome, everyone. Well, the biggest story this week, there's no doubt, the inauguration tomorrow of the 45th President of the United States, Donald Trump. Here in Illinois, we have a handful, at least 4 or 5 congressmen who are boycotting the inauguration. 60 representatives nationwide, all of them Democrats. And Ra, is that appropriate?
It's pretty unbelievable the moment we're in. I'm reminded of the ancient Chinese curse that says, "May you live in interesting times." We're entering into the Trump era in America. It's not surprising at all that people are choosing not to participate in his inauguration, including members of the Illinois congressional delegation. You know, we have a president-elect who really ran a divisive campaign. He's riding into the White House on a wave of hatred, bigotry, and fear. And I think it says a lot that people are willing to stand up and express their displeasure.
But Jane, is it disrespectful of the office of the presidency?
You know, I too find it unprecedented. And I think as lawyers, we try to think of prior experiences that would give us some guidance. And I don't know that while we can certainly point to presidents who were not liked or presidents that people worried would not be good for the country, there hasn't been this kind of divisiveness before.
But DELMARIE, doesn't the action of these representatives, doesn't that just add to the divisiveness by exacerbating the situation instead of trying to bring the country together?
Well, the key word is representatives, and that's what they're doing. They're representing their constituents, the ones who have decided not to attend the inauguration. And it doesn't mean that you don't honor the office of president. It just means that it's part of your free speech to not support this president and rationalize and normalize the kind of behavior that he exhibited during the campaign.
I want to read you what Representative Luis Gutierrez said. I'm not going to the inauguration of someone who's going to turn back the clock on women and immigrants. Ra, is that a policy difference? And I mean, Democrats and Republicans always have policy differences, but why not show up for this historic moment?
You know, I understand where Representative Gutierrez is coming from. I echo those sentiments. I also understand members of Congress who will be showing up and attending the inauguration. I used to work for Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, and at least...
And she's one of those who is not going?
Yeah, and earlier this week she was on the fence saying she wanted to be there as a witness to, on behalf of the resistance. And so, this is a very divisive individual. And I think his policies will be bad for our country. And I think the implications will be damaging not just for Chicago, but for our state.
Isn't this about more than just the person, though? Isn't the inauguration also a symbol of the peaceful transition of power in the world's oldest democracy?
Yes, it is. And I think to the country's credit, there is a smooth transition of power. And I think we're going to be looking for leaders who, as DELMARIE said, can bring together, can create something that is more positive and more hopeful for our future.
And we're having a smooth transition of power. I mean, if this were the other side, if all the things that are out there were out there and it was Hillary Clinton being inaugurated tomorrow, it would be a very different environment. And all the things that have been said and accused, and the Russians and the hacking and the rigging and the media and all of that, the Republicans would be very much up in arms over her inauguration. But Democrats have decided to do it peacefully.
But isn't that disrespecting the peaceful transition of power that the inauguration represents?
I don't think it's disrespecting the transition of power. I do think it would be more disrespectful if there were statements, not unlike Mitch McConnell when President Obama was sworn in, that the #1 agenda is to make President Obama a one-term president and to stop him at all costs. And I do hope there are things like transportation and infrastructure investments where Democrats and Republicans can find common ground with the president.
And here's a man who tried to delegitimize Barack Obama for five or 8 years of the presidency. So why is he okay? He can delegitimize Barack Obama, but then he cannot stand it when someone says it to him. And there's certainly more clouds around his being president than there was around Barack Obama being president. And then to attack John Lewis. I mean, that is
John
really...
Lewis is a representative from Georgia.
Exactly.
Civil rights icon.
Who is a civil rights icon. And to say and to show you that here's a man who will lie and just throw out lies by saying talk, 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 no action. And everyone who knows anything about Representative John Lewis knows that here's a man who put his life on the line to advance the civil rights of everybody, because everyone has benefited from the civil rights of African Americans.
And it's not just Democrats in Illinois who are not going. Governor Rauner is not going. Now, he's not boycotting. At the same time, he's a Republican governor, and he's not choosing to go to the inauguration. What does that tell you?
I'm going to say again, unprecedented. I don't know that I see it as a lack of respect, but it is a recognition of the great strife that's out there.
The other big story here in Chicago over the last week has been the Department of Justice investigation into the Chicago Police Department. Released a scathing report last week talking about systemic patterns of violence by police against certain communities. In the week since then, people have had a chance to digest the report. Let me begin with you, Rob. What is your sense of how the city has responded?
Well, I live here on the south side, and so the DOJ report simply validated what we've known for generations, and that there's a systemic pattern of abuse and neglect that disproportionately impacts communities of color in Chicago. I think the report really shines a light on a collective and colossal failure of leadership at all levels. If you think about training, you think about supervision, you think about discipline, there's a breakdown at every level. And it's time for change. Now, we were just talking about Trump and his incoming administration. I'm really concerned about his cabinet selections. And so it'll be interesting to see what the relationship is like with the federal government related to this report moving forward.
Jane, do you get a sense that the city is making the right steps toward that change?
Well, I think it is a very bright light that is being shined on it. And I think there is a sense of we want to embrace the report, we want to embrace the recommendations, we want to take this as an opportunity to make real improvement, recognizing that that's a challenge. It's pushing a big boulder up a steep hill. But I think there is a sentiment to do that. And by having the consent decree, there's a real mechanism for monitoring and enforcing it that has not been there in the past.
Of course, monitoring that defense decree and enforcing it will be the job of the new Department of Justice. The nominee for Attorney General is Jeff Sessions, Republican of Alabama, who has said in the last year or so that he believes American police have been maligned, basically. So, DELMARIE, given that context, what is your thought about the practical hope for reform in the police department with that consent decree?
Well, I don't think we're necessarily going to have leadership on the federal level for that. That's why we're going to have leadership on the local level. And the people of Chicago, the residents of Chicago, are going to have to insist that there be reform and that there be a consent decree. Because as we know, there's a nice face on this now, but there's been resistance for years to admit to the abuse and misconduct that has been within the police department for years. I mean, John Burge was not an isolated incident.
He's the former police lieutenant who was accused of torture.
Exactly. He was just the top of the iceberg in terms of understanding what is systemic and what is allowed and what has been enabled all of these decades.
Rob, one of the interesting things this past week is the police union came out clearly lukewarm about this report from the Department of Justice. What does that tell you?
No, I think that some folks are resistant to change and that some folks are okay with the status quo. And I think what DELMARIE just mentioned, all of that is connected to underlying issues of racism and inequality that often go unaddressed. And in addition to this being a moral issue and an issue about constitutional rights, there's also a huge financial component to this. The city of Chicago spends millions and millions and billions of dollars on lawsuits and settlements, and that's money that could be spent to empower our communities.
And just as you said, for the homeless, that was the story we just saw. And $200 million between 2012 and 2015 was spent beyond the budget that was allowed for police misconduct.
These are legal settlements that the city of Chicago
Exactly.
has made with the families of people who are the victims of violence.
Exactly, and that could go to needed programs to help the homeless, to help young people, to help crime, all of that.
At the same time, we know that the police department is in the midst of hiring 2,000 more officers in the next 2 years. Jane, are you encouraged by that?
Well, I think that I think there is a general sense that we need more police, but I think there are other parts that are equally important. It's not just more. We certainly need more and better training. I think that it has fallen to our police and our jails to serve as providers of mental health services, and they're not capable of doing it. We need some other systems within our society that provide that kind of support, so that police aren't trying to do something that they're woefully incapable of, which was certainly highlighted in Laquan McDonald.
Rob, what about you in terms of these new officers coming on? We've seen changes already in the police academy in the way that new police officers are trained to deal with situations, hopefully to have fewer police-involved shootings.
Well, I think what's discouraging is this notion that excessive force and a code of silence is kind of the standard operating procedure. And I think the DOJ report referenced a training video that was some 35 years old. I think it's great that we're adding the police to the police force and bringing in more officers of color, but it's not good enough to just make changes at the academy and in the department. We have to look at the law department, and we have to keep our elected officials feet to the fire on this, not just City Hall, but the City Council.
And one of the things that came out in another report earlier is that oftentimes the cops who have the least amount of experience are the ones who are going to the high crime areas, which also enables the police misconduct because they are not properly trained. They do not have the benefit of a veteran police officer to help them. And so those are all the kinds of things that have to be addressed when you're talking about going forward. You cannot police your way out of this. There's so many other components that need to happen in order to make these communities safe.
One of the components is the racial makeup of the Chicago Police Department. Superintendent Johnson has said that in the last year, almost 80% of those who applied to be Chicago police officers are either African American or Latino. Does it look like the superintendent is making efforts in that direction to make a more racially diverse police department?
I think that's an important part of the solution, and I give Superintendent Johnson credit for lifting that up as an issue and also being more present in the community and building bonds of trust and connection with residents of the city. So I think that's a small step in the right direction.
And presence in the community is going to be a key. It makes a difference if we have officers who are known and who know. And the whole community policing efforts are going to need some bolstering.
DELMARIE, do you agree that Johnson has been out in the community more than recent superintendents?
Oh, I think in many ways. I mean, from day one, he is of and from the community, and he understands that that's where the problem comes from. I mean, McCarthy didn't even want to meet, Gary McCarthy didn't even want to meet with the aldermen. The last budget hearing before he was dismissed, that was exactly what you heard from all the aldermen, that they have tried to meet with him, and he didn't want to meet with them. So Eddie Johnson knew going in that he had to have community support to make radical change in the police department.
We just have a few seconds left. It is the last day on the job for Barack Obama in White House. And in just a few seconds, a final thought on what his 8 years has meant for Chicago.
So I wish I had Kleenex. I would say what I really appreciate about President Obama's leadership is a message that he echoed in his farewell address, and that's the importance of citizenship and this notion that we have shared obligations to each other and to our city and to our country. And right now, we need active citizens.
Jane, how about you?
I can't say it better.
DELMARIE, you have about 15, 20 seconds.
Well, it shows that money cannot buy class. That's what the Barack Obama administration showed, because he brought class and grace to the White House, he and his family.
And what do you think he meant for Chicago?
For Chicago, I think, you know, it was hope. People who voted for him, this is where he got his start. And Chicago has been so instrumental for decades in breaking barriers electorally in Congress, president, senator, first woman senator who was black. So, I mean, this was a historic occasion for Chicago, and it was consistent with what we've done over the years.
Well, we begin a new era in about 24 hours or less, so buckle your seatbelts. Thanks to our guests, Rod Joy, Jane McCahill, and DELMARIE Cobb. Veterans on ice. Some returning military men and women are hitting the hockey rink to help them overcome physical and mental challenges they experienced while serving our country.
Retired Staff Sergeant, United States Army.
Illinois Army National Guard, Air National Guard.
In the United States Marine Corps.
Retired First Sergeant, United States Army.
My vehicle was struck by 7 IEDs. My left arm was blown off. They took my arm and reattached it as best they could. I had shrapnel that cut my left lung in half, PTSD, and traumatic brain injuries, TBI.
Post-traumatic stress disorder, multiple traumatic brain injuries.
I ended up having a spinal fusion done on my lower back and replaced the disc and have nerve damage down my legs.
Back problems, I've got some hearing problems, I've got some scars in a few different places. Doesn't stop me from playing hockey.
The transition out of the military is a very difficult one, especially for combat veterans.
There was not a program in place to help with that reintegration, and that's where hockey came in for me.
The Blackhawk Warrior team, it's not just a hockey team. It's really not just about players going out and skating around for 2 hours and coming off the ice. It's really about quality of life.
The Blackhawk organizations, they've been proud to support us. I don't know who admires who more, if the players admire the Warriors more or the Warriors admire the players.
The term for our team is Veterans on Ice. Half the team, we're here for support of the other guys.
You good? All right, let's go. It was very antisocial when I came out of the military. It was hard to feel accepted in a civilian community. It was hard to go out and meet new people. This team has bridged that gap between the military and the civilian lifestyles.
Everybody's got their little demons from their deployments, and it's okay here because that's who we are.
1, 2, 3, Warriors! All of us in one way or another have gone through traumatic experiences, have sacrificed things in our lives to do what we really want to do. So being here with the Blackhawk Warriors is almost therapeutic as well.
We're just helping each other navigate through life.
I have played hockey all of my life, and we have players out here who are brand new to the game and learning to skate.
We always say we play for the logo on our chest, not the name on our back.
You're out there on the ice and you're playing a game you love, you don't even realize that you're exercising, that you're doing amazing things that several years ago I thought I'd never do again. A lot of people say they don't even realize that I'm injured when I'm on the ice, and I take that as a compliment.
Good goal! Veterans that are out there that feel like they've got nothing, they feel like maybe they're isolated because nobody understands, we do.
Hey, great game, goalie. Great game, guys. Thanks, appreciate it.
We're there, we're here. Come seek us out.
It truly is one of my foundation blocks of recovery.
These are my heroes. Just a small portion of what I can give back to them.
And what a great story. That concludes tonight's show. You are now in the loop. To learn more about our show, our guests, and our stories, visit WYCC.org and connect to In the Loop. Until next week, I'm Chris Bury. Good night. Next week on In the Loop, legal marijuana is one of the fastest growing industries in the country, raking in billions of dollars. In last November's election, 8 more states passed initiatives allowing medical and recreational uses of the drug. So now, nearly half the states in the U.S. have legalized marijuana in some form. So what's ahead for the marijuana business in Illinois? We'll find out on the next In the Loop.